The meta of tomorrow, Kshatri-La? Well, maybe. Let's talk about it. The actual closest etymology that I could find specifically talked about high members of society and Indian society, but that's besides the point, guys. Let's get into it. I wanted to talk about the Kshatri-La archetype. That's how I'm going to call it because, you could just Kshatri-La, who knows what the hell you want to call it. Call it whatever you want to. It's a level 7 archetype based around psychic monsters with different attributes that basically have really interesting stats as well. And we'll get into that as we go along. But they're all psychics. They all pretty much spam themselves if you don't control any monsters. But we'll talk about Fenrir first. Fenrir essentially gets to special summon itself if you control no monsters, and then add a Kshatri-La monster from your deck to your hand. Those monsters that you can add, the other one would be Ogre. Ogre specifically says during your main phase you can special summon it and then get a trap from your hand as well. Also, in moving on, you obviously have to talk about Unicorn, which adds a spell. And last but not least, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these other cards that are also in the archetype, and that is Kshatri-La Birth, which essentially allows a lot of shenanigans inside of anything in the game that's level 7, which you'll see down here in the side deck portion. We'll have to come back to that in a second, but specifically the card says you get to normal summon a level 7 monster without tributing. Really, really nuts, guys. And also during the main phase, you get to special summon one of the Kshatri-La monsters that is banished or in your graveyard, which easily combos with a card like Sacred Sword of the 7 stars, which you 100% will need to pick up if you're planning on playing this deck. I would recommend it. Yes, you can play Prosperity. Yes, you can play Desires. Yes, you can play Upstart, and on and on. Yes, Monster Slots is a really, really interesting tech that I wanted to mention as well, because you essentially get to draw a card by essentially just playing the game and then mixing in some of these other cards as well, like the Dangers obviously get to set up a card like that. Now, in getting back to the Birth, it specifically gets to essentially put a card all the way out of the game anytime. If your opponent activates a spell card or effect and you control a Kshatri-La monster, you can target 3 cards in your opponent's graveyard and banish them. Not up to, so they have to have 3, but that is a really, really powerful effect, essentially power creeping some decks like Eldritch and so on and so forth. Prepare is the last card in the archetype besides the Exceed that I wanted to talk about, and Prepare essentially says during either player's turn you get special summon one of your Kshatri-La monsters that is banished or in your hand, also comboing off with Sacred Sword. If your opponent activates a trap card or effect while this card is face up in the spell or trap zone and you control a Kshatri-La monster, you can look at your opponent's hand and banish one card from it face down. That is really, really insane, guys. You won't get to know what the card is, but essentially taking a card all the way out of the game if they activate a trap or effect while it's on the field is really going to bump a lot of trap decks, what I really, really like. And last but not least, Shangri-La, which, if we want to touch on what Shangri-La means, a remote, beautiful place of paradise. Now, as far as the card itself, which doesn't really look like a paradise, it says during either standby phase, you can special summon one Kshatri-La monster from your deck. You can only use this effect of Kshatri-La, Shangri-La, once per turn. Each time an opponent's card is banished face down, card or cards, you can choose one unused main monster zone or spell and trap zone. It cannot be used while this monster is face up on the field. If this card would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can attach one material from it instead. Much like many cards that are boss monsters inside of new archetypes, it's really, really hard to get off the field. Now, obviously it has a weak attack stat, but really facilitates the entire deck being able to loop out onto the field, special summoning out other cards to then essentially grab more of the engine cards. Really hard to get off of the field, and obviously pairs off with some of the other cards like Birth and Prepare. Now let's get into some of the combos. I obviously wanted to show off essentially Unicorn and maybe a card that can be a level 7. I'm probably going to alter this in a little bit, but in essentially getting into the essential combo, special summoning out Unicorn allows you to add a Let's try that again. Kshatri-La spell from your deck to your hand. For me, each and every time, because there's only one card, is Birth, you get to easily have access to normal summoning any level 7 in the game. Remember, I mentioned Chaos Hunter and a lot of those other cards that I can go on and on and on about. Clearly, if you can see here, any of these cards, guys, any of these cards that you see are really, really interesting choices. I really like Yamada Dragon. I thought that was the funniest one that I saw. Just let's move on from that. Obviously, I'll have a separate Odd Eyes Pendulum video, and then essentially some of this other stuff. Mausoleum is just another card that you could have to essentially get some of the 7s out of your hand a little bit quicker if you wanted to go a different route. And then obviously some of the other cards, as well as some of the amazement stuff, as well as some of the adventure stuff, and obviously the Chaos Hunter, as I mentioned. Anyways, getting back into it, those are some of the cards that you'll see here featured in a second as well. Unicorn gets to add the spell. The spell allows you to add pretty much any 7 in your hand out onto the field. I just wanted to show what happens if you open, let's say, 2 of the Kshatri-La monsters. Ogre is the other one, which essentially allows you to add a trap, so you get another profit. Normal summoning the Ogre without tributing allows you to add Prepare. Prepare is the card, again, it says during your player's turn you can special summon one of your Kshatri-La monsters that is banished or in your hand. So essentially, being able to have those 2 starting off, you get to have the spell and the trap, and then overlay into the Shangri-La, and then getting into what it would actually look like passing off your turn. During your standby phase, you get to special summon out yet another one. Now obviously you could add the Fenrir out onto the field. You don't really need that. It doesn't really matter because they're all going to do the same thing pretty much during the battle phase, or when your opponent activates a monster effect. They all pretty much do the same thing to be able to trigger your opponent to banish something face down, to start taking away zones, and that happens very, very quickly. Now essentially, guys, and moving on, let's say that the game continues to play out. Each and every time that they do something, they just keep getting stuff taken away. Zones get taken away each time something is special summoned out, and you just continuously just murder them over and over again with level 7s. Moving on, I wanted to talk about some of the other 7s that it will be cards that you definitely have to consider. Illusion of Chaos, as well as Dark Magician and all the soul stuff. Moving directly into some of the stuff, going directly into an Eben Illusion Magician to special summon out another Dark Magician. That's some of the stuff as far as engines that you could play. Obviously, I wanted to mention a card like Big Eye, because, well, let's say Big Eye mixed with playing Phantasme as well as Nibiru could mean that you could OTK your opponent at any time if they're playing wombo combos. If the meta that we're in has wombo combo decks and Nib is really popular, that means Big Eye is going to be really popular because it's going to be punching people for game. Essentially, only he can attack. Obviously, I mentioned the amazement stuff as well. The Mech Knights are really, really interesting because the yellow and the red one are both level 7s, and you make columns really, really easy. The Exceed can go up here, and any of the cards that you add to your hand in the Kshatri-La archetype get to set out on the field, and then you essentially have a column immediately. So these are cards that you definitely have to consider as well. Mechanical Hound is an interesting card, and Chaos Hunter and Pankratops are just really, really interesting cards. Completely shutting off your opponent's ability to play spell cards is really, really nuts. And it's one-sided, which is really, really insane. That could be a Vanity's Ruler and Drytron style of effect if that ever comes to it, but I just don't see that much of a control variant coming out. But you could have one if you do have the right setup in the right hand and you don't really brick. Obviously, normal summoning Chaos Hunter is nuts. Clearly, Pankratops, I think this would really be really nuts in the mirror as well. Pankratops is a level 7, don't forget about it. Sacred Sword, obviously, as I said, combos off with a whole lot of the other stuff. And then monster slots, like I had mentioned before. Now, clearly there are plenty more to talk about, which I'm going to get back to in a second. Essentially, if you have Birth, remember that you always have that banishing 3 cards in your opponent's graveyard effect. That's like a dancing needle style of effect inside of this deck. It's definitely going to be strong potential. So at the floor, I would say this deck is at least Musketeers. Obviously, with some of the other cards that I have to mention, the adventure stuff is level 7. So I would recommend playing multiples of those, which I can show off, and then clearly I already mentioned this, but the adventure stuff is really, really interesting because if you're not going for a basic build like this, then essentially you have to go for another build where you could essentially revolve everything around the adventure stuff and have a really fluid game state as well. Phantasma is just me goofing around. That could be anything. As long as it's a level 7 and it can come out on the field fluidly, have at it, guys. Because a card like this, Ice Barrier, the medium of the Ice Barrier, locking your opponent out of being able to play more than one spell a trap card is like Rose Whip. You know, this is how much stuff that you're going to have to experiment with. Now, as far as experimentation, you have to really look at all of the rank 7s as well, because the entire deck revolves around Mind Hacker. Mind Hacker is really, really nuts because it triggers a lot of this stuff to happen. Essentially, Mind Hacker says once per turn, you can detach one material from this card, look at your opponent's extra deck and banish it, which allows you to trigger Shangri-La immediately. And then if this triggers and this triggers and this trigger, and then essentially before you know it, you've taken out your opponent's whole board and some of their back row. And if they're playing a wombo combo deck and you keep triggering stuff before they can set up, guys, that's just really, really nuts. So either way, if you wanted to play it with adventure, or if you wanted to play it just normally with just turboing out level 7s as fast as possible, it's really going to be up to you. Look forward to the Odd Eyes version. It should be right here, and we'll see you next time. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Pegasus signing out. Arrivederci.